the spread of these documents has been so caught up with crises, emergencies, the rise of new states, new polities wanting to declare their existence to the world, and having a document that you can write down, you can print it, you can send it off, not just round your own country, but to different parts of the world and say, look, here we are. We may have been ruled or controlled by other people. We may not have had the boundaries that we now claim, but here we are. We have a new system and we've written it down. So I think that's one reason why writing it down, it becomes important. It's not just for domestic audiences, it's because increasingly states want to explain themselves, declare themselves to the world.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have with us noted historian Sushri Linda Colley on our show. Welcome, Linda.
Hello.
Today we will discuss Linda's book, The Gun, the Ship, and the Pen, Warfare of Constitution and the Making of the Modern World. Starting not with the United States, but with the Corsican Constitution of 1955, the gun, the ship, and the pen moves through every continent, disrupting accepted narratives. Throughout, Colley demonstrates how constitutions evolve in tandem with warfare, and how they have functioned to advance empire as well as promote nations and work to exclude as well as liberate. This is one of the most original global histories in decades. Linda Colley is the Shelby M.C. Davis 1958 Professor of History at Princeton University. She is an expert on British, imperial, and global history. So, Linda, what led you to write a book about the history of constitutions?
Well, I think I had both intellectual and historical motives on the one hand and personal motives on the other. Let me mention the personal motives first. I don't think I was conscious of those at the outset, but I've become conscious retrospectively. As my accent probably suggests, my country of birth is the United Kingdom, which is one of only 3 states left in the world that don't have a codified constitution of some kind. But in 1982, I moved to teach in the United States, first of all at Yale. And so I had to get used to a new country, which not only had a written constitution, but made a real cult of its written constitution as an emblem of identity. And so I became curious about what this kind of political device was, and how it could work or not work, and how it could inspire deep attachment. So that was the more personal side. And I should say, I think that if the UK survives, which it may not, I believe it should have its own written constitution, but that's another matter. The more intellectual and historical motive was this. Most books and studies about written constitutions focus on an individual nation state, or perhaps a part of the world, a single part of the world. But as I looked at this more, it seemed to me that there was a global story here, that after about 1750, the rate of creation of codified constitutions just keeps speeding up at an exponential rate, and it's still speeding up now. So that already by 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, already you've got constitutions of this sort in parts of every continent. And I didn't think, therefore, that just focusing on national stories, which of course are important, but I didn't feel that that was giving us the whole picture. And I wanted to tell a wider story. I also wanted to get away from assuming a kind of teleological grand narrative whereby the rise of constitutions means the inexorable rise of democracy. It's a lovely idea, but democracy has gone up and down, we know. And in practice, too, these kind of constitutions have serviced different kinds of political regimes. We can't, and we should take that for granted now, we can't assume that because a state has a written constitution, it is a fully functioning democracy. Perhaps it is, but very often that isn't so. So I thought that I wanted to tell a more global story and also a more complicated story, if you like.
Your book is about the history of constitution, and yet you have guns and ships in the title. Is the history of constitution is that violent?
It is often violent. I think that what I meant by that was that very often when it comes to writing a brand new constitution, this happens because of or immediately after some kind of existential crisis, a war of independence, a military invasion, perhaps a war of conquest when you start grabbing new territory, a civil war, a devastating invasion. I mean, there can be other stimuli as well, but this kind of great disturbance helps often to focus minds and force hands. And, you know, India would be a case in point. Interest in written constitutions, you can certainly see in different parts of the Indian subcontinent in different parts of the 19th century. But to get the great constitution making of 1947 to 50 accomplished takes a Second World War and the shattering decline of Britain, which basically forces the British out of India and permits this great work of constitution making to exist. Arguably, though you can tell the story right back to the 19th century, but the precipitant, the immediate precipitant is this vast global war after 1939.
Well, when was the first constitution ever drafted? What is the story behind it?
Well, of course, it depends what you regard as a constitution. Some people, there are Islamic historians who focus on particular Islamic documents and claim that these are quasi-constitutions and go back certainly to the 17th century, if not before. There are written constitutions in Europe. Paradoxically, there's one in England in 1653, the instrument of government, but it doesn't last very long. And of course, there are constitutions which take a different, form than the kind of written constitution we take for granted now. The Greek city-states in classical times had certain sorts of constitutional systems. But if we're talking about single document, codified constitutions, which have the status of fundamental law and are put into print so that they can be widely read and move overseas and be translated into other languages and influence other people, then I think it's much more a mid-18th century development, which speeds up from there. And it's very much connected with, the growth of literacy, the growth of print, more postal systems, better transports, more education, and so forth. And that goes on and on and on. Again, looking at the Indian subcontinent, the first large-scale printings of other people's constitutions we can see in Calcutta newspapers in the 1820s, when Kolkata is already a great world center of print. And you get these reprints of constitutions from South America, constitutions from Europe, often reprinted by Indian and European radical activists who want to make political points about India itself. So I think print is really important for oiling the production of these legal and political documents.
Okay, so we have already discussed the two words in the title of your book. The third word is pen. So what is the need to bring in pen and write down the constitution? Isn't it just a set of guiding principles on how to administer masses? It's not that the written principles don't get flouted, right? It does happen. So how does writing and codifying help?
Well, of course, some experts would say it's not necessary. Some experts would say, it is right to say that constitutionalism can't anywhere be reduced to a single document. There has to be a lot of other things, traditions, ideas, cultures of constitutionalism, if you like. So the document itself is not the whole story. But why does it matter? Well, I think partly it mattered precisely because the spread of these documents has been so caught up with crises, emergencies, the rise of new states, new polities wanting to declare their existence to the world. And having a document that you can write down, you can print it, you can send it off, not just round your own country, but to different parts of the world and say, look, here we are. We may have been ruled or controlled by other people. We may not have had the boundaries that we now claim, but here we are. We have a new system and we've written it down. So I think that's one reason why writing it down, it becomes important. It's not just for domestic audiences, it's because increasingly states want to explain themselves, declare themselves to the world. But of course, domestically, you write a constitution for legal purposes, so that your law courts will hopefully guard it and administer it and protect it. You also hope I think that it will have an educative function and a communicative function to your own citizens, so that people, even if they're not particularly interested in politics, even perhaps if they don't have much education or perhaps no education at all, there will be a document which either they will read or someone will read to them, and they'll say, look, this is how your polity is supposed to work. This is what your rights are. This is what you must not do. And a written text has a kind of authority, and it lends itself to wide communication. What, of course, no human creation can do is guarantee the conduct of other humans necessarily. All written constitutions, like everything else that human beings create, are potentially fragile. You have to work to protect them, you have to work to implement them. So they're not guarantees, but they are perhaps the best that we can do.
Generally, when we talk about constitutions, people generally associate it with democracies. I mean, but in your book, you give several examples of monarchies implementing it. So what was the need?
Well, I did want to make this point that, and I was partly thinking of my American friends, given that I work in the United States, because it's almost natural for them to associate constitutions with the one that was drafted in Philadelphia in 1787, which confirms the creation of the new United States after the War of Independence against the British, and it's a republic. And so Americans often instinctively assume that constitutionalism and republicanism and nationalism are all joined, absolutely. And I really wanted to shake the tin, if you like, and say, no, it's not quite like that. Indeed, it's not like that at all. Right up to the early 20th century, a majority of polities, and not just in Europe, but in parts of the Americas, in many parts of Asia, in many parts of Africa, are monarchies or kinds of monarchies. And many of these places use written constitutions. So Hawaii, small islands in the Pacific, the king of Hawaii presides over a succession of codified constitutions from 1840 onwards, setting out the contours of a Hawaiian political state. And, this is a monarchy. It's certainly not a fully fledged democracy. But the Hawaiian monarchs think that using a constitution, again, will proclaim their independent existence to the rest of the world and may prevent them from being taken over by a European power or by the United States. Well, that works up to the 1890s until Hawaii is indeed absorbed by the United States, which it remains to this day. So that's one appeal of a printed and written constitution for small and endangered monarchies in the 19th century. You can see the same thing happening elsewhere, that you hope it will keep the bad guys away. It will allow you to reinforce your autonomy and separate existence. In other ways, too, it can be a sign of modernity. As more and more of these devices spread across the globe, there's the feeling, which you increasingly get after 1850, that if you're a modern state with a sense of confidence and ambition in yourself, you really need a written constitution. And so after a big civil war in Japan in the 1860s, when you get the creation of a new Japanese imperial state, the Japanese decide very quickly that they have to have a written constitution to confirm their transformation into a new regime. Now, it's emphatically not a democratic constitution. It focuses on an oligarchy. It genuflects to the power of the Japanese emperor. And Japan becomes a very aggressive empire in its own right. But this 1889 Japanese constitution becomes very important for the rise of Asian constitutionalism because it survives. And many Indian nationalists, for example, at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, look at what Japan's been doing and say, well, hey, so, these devices, they don't just cater to the West. The East can have them too. And they can survive and continue. And states that have them in the East, like Japan, can become very powerful. So here's a very big example of a emphatically non-democratic constitution, nonetheless having a big impact on the world much more largely.
When you think about the concept of constitution, one would expect that fairness and equal rights should be one of the guiding principles. However, very often that is not the case. Right? For instance, the US Constitution didn't allow women's suffrage until 1920. So how does it happen that a very basic principle such as equality of rights is missing so often in the Constitution?
Well, it depends which part of the world and which time of the world you're looking at. We may believe passionately in equality of opportunity and rights now, though I have to say that not everybody on the face of the globe seems absolutely convinced about that. But at least most people know they must at least pay lip service to that as an ideal. But that was not an ideal that people necessarily assumed in the 18th century or before that. It was very largely taken for granted all over the globe that women, unless they were monarchs, were outside the political sphere. They had their own functions, of course, that were important, but politics was a male preserve, and full citizen rights, therefore, needed to be confined to men. And that is a dominant notion. There are a few exceptions. I write in my book about tiny Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific, which gives votes to its tiny female population in 1838. But this is very, very rare. And again, I think what partly changes this gradually is war. That after the First World War and in the First World War, women become more drawn on in many countries for different kinds of wartime service, either in the factories or in agriculture or in the forces at some level. And this helps many people begin to see women much more as potentially active citizens, not just beings who mainly reside in the home. So that's one lack of equality that the constitutions really don't, really practice for a long time. The idea that women are just different. Then there's the element of racism, of course, and also a lack of sympathy with very often indigenous peoples, particularly indigenous peoples who perhaps cannot read or write. How do you and should you incorporate indigenous peoples who don't have a culture of writing? Should you absorb them into written constitutions? Lots of powers in the 19th century assume not. I mean, Native Americans in the United States tend not to have the vote until the 20th century. Indigenous peoples in Australia are increasingly left out of voting. And this becomes more apparent in the early 20th century. So there's many inequities which are not just retained by constitutions, but may even be strengthened by them, because a constitution can write things down and can say, well, the voting will be confined to male citizens, or these particular tribal peoples will be excluded, or whatever. So the fact that a constitution is written increasingly can deepen pre-existing inequalities, I think.
It's a very diverse country. I mean, people from so many faiths, caste, creed, right? I mean, so it must be very difficult to draft constitution for such a diverse country. I mean, do you see that happening in the history, or probably my assertion is wrong?
You mean the challenge of writing a constitution for India, for a free India?
A country as diverse as India.
Yeah. Well, of course, it was a challenging task, and many great scholars have written about that. And one of the exciting things at the moment is how many young scholars like Rohit Day and Madhav Goslar are revising ideas about the Indian constitution and finding new information about its making. After all, it takes quite a long time, 1947, 1950. And the challenge is deeper because simultaneously, India has to become a post-colonial society. So it's astonishing that it's produced with all the skill and effort that goes into it in a relatively short time. And of course, it's a huge document, as you know better than I. Over 500 pages? I don't know if it's still the longest constitution in the world, but it is a very long constitution. What helps, and this is often seen as controversial by some, is that like so many constitution writers, the Indian lawyers and politicians and civil servants who draft this great constitution borrow. They borrow huge amounts from different parts of the world. They borrow from British legislation in the 1930s. They borrow from Australia. They borrow from Canada, the United States, and so forth. this is often criticized, and of course it may change in the future. But in fact, if you look at it historically, this happens over and over again. Lots of countries act this way because ideas, they read about other countries' constitutions. They say, "Oh, that's a good idea about the separation of powers. We're gonna use it in our constitution." And in fact, in some constitutions, particularly ones that are drafted very quickly, you find not just obvious plagiarism of this kind, but sometimes the entire word and paragraph structure gets duplicated. I mean, the Norwegian Constitution of 1814, which after the United States Constitution is the second oldest to survive, is just an essay in plagiarism. And, they take whole sentences and chunks from France, from America, from Belgium, and so forth. And they just bung it into their own constitution. But it's how you borrow from others and what you choose to borrow and how you intermesh this with your own legal traditions and political priorities that makes a constitution work. And, this was the great achievement of the Indian legislators, that, yes, they borrowed a lot, but they interweaved these borrowings with certain indigenous traditions, legal priorities, ideals that they wanted to incorporate. And, it's not a perfect constitution, none of them are, but it has lasted thus far.
Constitution formation is very global. Events happening in one part of the world might ideate the principle of constitution in another part of the world. You give several examples in your book. Please talk about that.
Well, as I've just been talking about, it is partly this, if you like, this borrowing across continents, this selective borrowing, when because of print, because these documents can be translated, issued in different countries, countries then adopting their new constitutions can take bits from different parts of the globe and bring it together. And as I say, and I've already suggested this, by the end of the 19th century, the idea has got around, which is a very influential one, that this is a sign of a modern state. That said, of course, the nature of constitutions and what they do change over time. Initially, constitutions were very focused on politics, the structures of government, rights, the limitations of rights, those sort of things. But as time passes, ideas of what you can include in these constitutions changes also. So with the rise of Marxism and socialism, for example, people become increasingly and the spread of the electorate, people become increasingly interested in parts of the world in, can you use constitutions to guarantee the status of trade unions, to ensure better welfare facilities, to provide for mass education. And you see more and more constitutions with the First World War and after beginning to adopt this more socialist type content. And an early pre-war example of that is the Mexican Constitution, a very radical document which comes out before the First World War and basically says we are going to reduce the power of the landowners in Mexico, confiscate their landed estates, and use some of the proceeds to set up welfare provisions for ordinary Mexican men, women, and children. And that attracts a lot of attention. And you can see socialist constitutions in Eastern Europe, in Weimar Germany after the First World War, trying to pick up on that so that constitutions become vehicles of social betterment. And of course, this is something that Indian legislators are very committed to as well. Then another shift that you can see becoming more prominent with constitutions that have been written or revised in the past 2 decades is whether you can use constitutions for ecological purposes, for climate control, for insisting that, certain natural resources should not be squandered. And that's a new emphasis. There are limited examples before, say, 1970, 1980, of constitutions being much concerned with the environment. But constitutions written since then in some parts of the world have become much more emphatic on the environment. And I suppose that's one reason why it's important that amending a constitution should be a constant and recurring process, that human beings, human history changes over time. And what makes a good constitution in one period may be very out of date even 20 years later. The great American founding father, though he's become a controversial figure, Thomas Jefferson, I mean, he was an important learned man. He was also a slave owner, and that's what makes him controversial now. But he had a very radical conception of codified constitutions. And he said, well, a society like ours in the United States is changing so rapidly. We really should revise our constitution every 17 or 18 years. You could make a case that that's true for many societies now. That however good a constitution is, it can become out of date quite quickly.
Right. Adding to that, the constitutional amendment, right? How it help in survival of a constitution, like taking the Indian example, right? So far, we have more than 100 constitutional amendments. So taking the 1976 example, during the emergency, like we certainly, the words like secularism and religious freedom was inducted in the constitution, and the parliamentary period, right, extended to 6 years, and the directives principle was added, and then the fundamental duties were added. And we see every year, like twice a year, the constitutional amendments happen. So is it necessary to, for survival of a constitution, the amendments is necessary? What's your thought on that?
Well, I think it helps, not least because it keeps focusing minds on the Constitution. It makes people think about it more. And I think one of the many problems that my adopted country, the United States, has now is that, its codified constitution is in its origin very old, 1787, not finally ratified till 1788, 89. There have been amendments since then, but they're relatively few, far fewer than the situation you describe in India. And because the founding fathers were so worried about whether the United States could survive, they deliberately made amending their constitution hard work. It can't be done easily. And given that politics in the US are so polarized at the moment, to try and get a majority of states and a majority of politicians in Congress to accept significant amendment of the US Constitution, really, really hard, unless, of course, again, you've got some kind of major emergency which forces your hand, or some great change of circumstance. But yes, I mean, I think amendments do help, and the good contrast, if you like, with the United States is Norway, which I've already mentioned, which is the second oldest surviving constitution. They're always doing amendments, and I think that's helped to keep the Norwegian constitution going, and still to have an effect. That said, of course, one thing we haven't mentioned is what happens with these devices in an age that no longer operates around print so much, but we are in the digital age. People get most of their political information, if they get any at all, from a screen, not from a printed page. So, are these devices, have they passed their sell-by date in some way? Do they need to be rethought so that they can work in an age where people can just go on the web and get really freaky political ideas? They're not going to read the Constitution. How do you cope with that? And how do you cope, of course, and this is an issue for India as increasingly for other countries, how do you cope with the rise of popularism, the rise of different forms of autocratic, charismatic rule? All these things challenge kind of idealistic conception of what a constitution can do. So, continuing work and attention is needed with these subjects, I believe.
All right. So the founding principles of a constitution might get outdated over time, as we discussed. Has it ever happened that an outdated constitution led to an uprising and an armed conflict?
That's a very interesting question, and I wish I knew the answer, but I don't. So I shall have to think about that more. I'd like to think of examples, but I haven't got one on hand. What I will say, which, and this surely is significant, that even if a written constitution is pushed to one side by, say, a revolution or a war or invasion or whatever, usually what happens, almost always, is you then get a new constitution being written. Very interestingly, I can't think of any state which has once had a written constitution, then gets rid of it for whatever reason, then deciding that in the future it's not going to have a codified constitution. It's done that. It's not trying anymore. I don't know that has ever happened. People may be disillusioned with a particular constitution. They may get rid of it, but usually when they do that, they create another one. And that surely tells us something, that this political technique, this piece of political technology, at the moment has sunk deep in the way that states continue to operate and think about themselves.
Talking about, I mean, in the current modern world, I mean, recent times we have been seeing, I mean, diversity versus homogeneity issues, right? Within a nation state, we have Brexit happening, we have Japanese immigration are so strong, and then we have people, I mean, who, from Syria arriving on in Germany, right? So we have all these political issues going on. I mean, so this is related to that. I mean, do we see that constitutions for diverse versus homogeneous countries? I mean, for diverse countries, probably there are more chances of conflict happening. I mean, do they survive lesser time compared to a country with homogeneous population?
Well, as you pointed out earlier, India has such a diverse makeup and always has. But certainly, I think for political states that previously have not been particularly diverse, the huge rise in long distance migration patterns, which is going to become more and more pronounced, particularly if global warming takes an even worse route in the future than it's done thus far. I mean, we're going to get lots of people moving out of parts of the world that are no longer easily habitable because they've become too hot or too dry or too flood strewn or whatever. And so the challenges of that are often discussed in terms of racial conflict. And of course, that's very striking, and cultural conflict. But equally striking is, as you suggest, the challenge to political norms. How do you cope with that? That is causing problems in all sorts of states, I think, like France, where the essence of its constitutions, ever since the French Revolution, have been very much on secularism, that to be a French citizen is not a religious position. You are a citizen first and foremost. How do you combine that tradition with a rising Muslim population which says, no, we are perhaps Muslim first, and we have certain traditions of female dress, what can be taught at schools, etc., etc. And this is causing all sorts of tensions, which can be exaggerated, but I think they're there. And it means, you've got to think about these things. How do you both continue to do duty to values that have been held for a long time and the values of large numbers of people moving in who have their own rights, of course? How do you keep that together in a constitutional system? And it's one of the challenges.
So what projects are you currently working on?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that. I have various ideas, but I have to say that The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, which came out in March, is the longest book I've ever written. It's not long by some writers' standards. I mean, some of my friends produce books that are 800 pages long and seem to do that every few years. My book is 500 plus pages long, but this for me was quite huge. And so to a degree, I'm still in recovery mode, if you like. And I suspect that the ideas I have will not really congeal till, say, next year. But I have become convinced that I like working on global history. It's a tremendous challenge, but it's so interesting constantly talking to scholars and writers and thinkers from different parts of the world and trying to think, to re-describe the past in a way that you're not just looking at it through the lens of your own particular nation or region. And I find global history both extremely hard to do and totally exhausting, but very exhilarating.
Yeah, so since you described like you are a professor of global history, right? So like general trend is that like a student picks one topic or one continent or one country and then goes on research on then and become a master of that and become a professor. So how it is difficult to manage this vast topic of global historian? How do you do it?
Well, with difficulty is the obvious answer, and you have to become parasitic on all sorts of other experts because, as you suggest, no one has the range of languages, the range of knowledge. Human life is not long enough to even touch more than a tiny fraction of the history books that have been written. So one becomes very dependent on scholars and writers and books written from experts on different parts of the world. And of course, you never get it absolutely right, even if you write about your own country and a small topic in your own country. You're going to make mistakes. If you're ranging across the globe, you're going to make even more mistakes. So I suppose what I would say also you need to write or even attempt world history is probably to reach a certain age so that you've done a lot of reading and met a lot of people, but also to have academic tenure and or perhaps to have retired or whatever. But this is not something that a young scholar who is perhaps insecure in his or her job, I wouldn't recommend them trying this because leave it till you're older when you are more secure. But I think it's one of the exciting things about the way that history has evolved in recent decades. Global history is not, I stress, the history of the whole world and of everything that's happened into it. But it is a way of saying what happens in one place can have an impact on another place, and that it helps to look at different parts of the world in tandem so that you can see connections and divergences and borrowings much more clearly than you would if you just said, oh, I'm going to work purely on India or purely on France or purely on China or whatever. So it's not the only way of writing history, but I think it has its own rewards. Okay, but I think this is great. So thank you for reaching out and making contact with me.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for discussing this book. I mean, spending time with us for about 1 hour and talking about your future projects. We wish you best.
Okay, well, thank you so much and take care.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Bye.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.